Afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to this special event with the Iris film series. Let's see, I guess we'll get started with just sort of me introducing the sponsors of today's event. They are the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, known as LACIS, and the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, known as the IRIS NRC. My program, which is LACIS, engages K through 14 community and business outreach, as well as being home to an undergraduate major, a master's degree, a master's JD degree, and a PhD minor. The IRIS NRC supports and enhances global awareness and inspires informed thinking about the complexities of our world. We provide resources and expertise to K through 12 and post-secondary educators, students, and the community at large. Also, I should introduce myself to you all, which I should have started with, my name is Sarah Ripp, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. S.E. Lenchner will be running tech support. So if you have any challenges, use the chat function, please, to contact her. We will be recording today's event and sharing the link and digital resources in a post-event email. You will only show up on the recording if your microphone is turned on to speak. Please enter any questions in the chat for the Q&A portion during the final 15 minutes of the event. Also, sort of depending on how busy the online chat is, if you are interested in asking your question verbally, you could raise your hand, please, and then unmute yourself. So with that said, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Today, we are fortunate to be joined by two experts on Latin America with a long-standing relationship with the Madison Architau Sister City Project. Please join me in welcoming Geoff Thale and Barbara Mergen Alvarado. Geoff is an expert on human rights and U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, with a particular focus on El Salvador and Cuba. He holds a master's degree in industrial relations from UW-Madison and previously taught at a high school in New England. He worked at the Washington office on Latin America, known as WOLA, for 26 years, retiring in 2021 as its president. At WOLA, which is a leading DC-based nonprofit advancing human rights and social justice, he focused on Central America, especially El Salvador and Nicaragua, addressing issues of human rights, security, and economic opportunity. He also founded WOLA's Cuba programming, promoting normalization of U.S.-Cuban relations and fostering dialogue between Cuban civil society and international counterparts. Active on El Salvador issues since the 1980s, he helped establish the Madison Architau Sister City relationship while at UW-Madison. He later founded the El Salvador Policy Project in Washington, D.C., and has led multiple congressional delegations, testified before Congress, and written extensively on the peace process, street gangs, and policy responses to violence. Barbara Mergen Alvarado has over 40 years of experience facilitating collaboration across linguistic, cultural, and class divides through participatory education for systemic change. She integrates activism into her professional life, promoting nonviolent structural transformation. She lived in Mexico City for 25 years, working with human rights organizations such as El Centro Nacional de Comunicación Social and Oxfam Mexico. A professional translator and interpreter, she was a worker owner of the Interpreters Cooperative of Madison. She feels fortunate to be an honorary fellow with the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, which allows her to continue linking her professional work and activism with North, Central, and South America. So I will end there and turn it over to Geoff to provide some context and background on some of the things that were covered in the film. So thank you all for joining us today.
Great. Well, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation to speak and to once again watch Maria's story, which I hadn't seen in a number of years, but is a great film. And thanks to everybody who's here and interested in the issues, this set of issues and talking about them. There's a lot to unpack in Maria's story. It's a really powerful movie. It's a very moving story in a lot of ways, and a very personal one. And just in passing, I hope we'll come back to this in questions. A really interesting documentary in thinking about the role of women and the leadership role women play in a fairly, in some ways, very traditional rural society. So it's a great and powerful movie. And what I hope to do in about 25 minutes, maybe, is talk a little about the context of the war in El Salvador, how that war began, sort of where Maria's story fits in that, and then a little bit about sort of where post-war El Salvador has gone, the ups and the downs of that process, a little bit about the issues of gang violence, which people have probably heard a fair amount about, and then with kind of where we are in El Salvador today. And then I'll touch a little bit on the Madison Arcatao story, but Barbara really has a lot more to say about that than I do, and I think we'll kind of go back and forth on that. So let me just sort of jump in. As you all probably know, and I know there's a pretty diverse audience with a range of knowledge and background, but El Salvador is a pretty tiny country. I for years showed an educational program that started off saying El Salvador is the size of Massachusetts, and that's about right. It's only about an eighth the size of the state of Wisconsin, so it's a very small, compact place. Maria herself, from Arcatao, is from a tiny corner of northeast El Salvador. It's uh, it's a very rural area. Arcatao, she says, had at one time 10,000 people, and that makes it a really big city for the area. Most people are subsistence farmers who supplement their subsistence their survival by being seasonal laborers in big agro export, at the time, big agro export plantations that did coffee, sugar, and cotton more than anything else. Um, so the Civil War itself in El Salvador began around 1980. There are debates about how you mark the exact starting date, but began around 1980, lasted until a peace agreement in 1992. Um, but the civil unrest and conflict in El Salvador had been building for a long time. Small guerrilla groups, kind of inspired on the one side by the Cuban Revolution, and frankly, on the other side by student unrest in the United States and in Europe, probably started in the early 70s in El Salvador. Um, Severe repression and pretty ugly human rights abuses took place almost immediately in response to not just the guerrilla groups, but public protest and activism. And the elections in both 1972 and 1977 were stolen by the military and the extreme right. And, in some countries, stealing elections involves cheating at the ballot box. In 1977, the army showed up, literally, troops showed up at the ballot boxes, carried them away without bothering to count them, and announced who the victor was. So it's a pretty blatant and pretty ugly process. Um, in this period, El Salvador is a very rural country. Um, as I said, you've got a lot of subsistence farmers, and then you have a relatively small group of agro exporters in coffee, in cotton, in sugar, and then kind of all the things that come from that. Connected to that, obviously, you've got this wildly unequal distribution of wealth and of land. Three quarters in 1980, three quarters of all the land in the country was owned by 0.1% of the population. And in a country where agriculture is what people live on, what that means is you have tremendous inequities in wealth and wide disparities. Um, as I said, the government has been run by the military, dominated by the military, at least from 1932 through the beginning of the Civil War, and certainly since post World War II. The Salvadoran government, despite its military character, despite elections being overthrown, had been supported by the United States in the context of the Cold War as an anti-communist ally. And we provided diplomatic support, we provided military equipment, we provided training to the military and the police. And all of that kind of despite awareness of the abuses that were and undemocratic things that were being carried out by the government and the military. So um, in all that context, unrest grew in El Salvador in the 1970s. Rising food prices, falling coffee prices, people feeling squeezed. All this led to the emergence of student activism, of peasant activism, which Maria talks about in the movie. She mentions the UTC, the Union of Farm Workers, emerges in the mid 70s. Liberation theology kind of bubbles through El Salvador in this period and inspires a tremendous amount of activism among the poor. And you don't see it in the movie, but Maria actually was Maria and many people in Arcatao and in rural parts of the country were very moved by that and part of kind of social and political activism that came out of liberation theology. And again, in response to all this, repression is really serious. The first priest is killed in 1977. Um, Community organizers, trade union leaders begin to be systematically targeted and attacked for disappearances and assassinations in the 70s by units of the military, units of the National Guard, what was called the Treasury Police in El Salvador, the National Police, and by death squads, civilians, heavily armed, who pick people up, carry them off, and they were never seen again. And all of that sort of culminates with the assassination of Monsignor Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, and now a Catholic saint, actually, in March of 1980. Romero delivers a sermon in which he calls on troops not to engage in repression, and he's just called on President Carter to stop supporting the Salvadoran military. And the week after he makes that call, he's assassinated while saying Mass. 6 months after that, three North American churchwomen are brutally raped and murdered by the Salvadoran military. Briefly, in response to that, the US stops military aid. But then in 1981, when this all kind of comes to a head and full-scale civil war breaks out, the US, and then with the arrival of the Reagan administration, really ups its support for the Salvadoran military and the intention to defeat uh, the armed left. So it's actually the guerrillas launched an offensive in early 1981. They've got pretty broad popular support, and the military begins over the first couple of years of the war to follow a strategy that really comes from Vietnam. And it's a strategy of counterinsurgency. It's a strategy where you look at an area where you think the guerrillas are active, you set out to drive everybody, guerrillas and civilians, to drive everybody out of the area so that anybody is left is by definition a military target, and you can engage in it as a free fire zone. And it's in that context you get a series of massacres. And in the movie, there's a scene where Maria is crossing a partially destroyed bridge, and she points down the river and says, "There was a massacre down there." And that's one of the early big massacres that the military carried out on hundreds of people fleeing from one of these mass waves of military attacks. And several hundred people were killed, tried to cross the Rio Sumpul into Honduras. Um, so despite this kind of a assault by the Salvadoran military, the guerrillas actually advance over the first 2 or 3 years. In response, the US helps the Salvadoran military restructure, starts providing additional intelligence, starts providing additional air support, and a pretty brutal air war from 1984 through 86, 87 maybe, pushes the guerrillas back seriously into sort of their mountain strongholds, places like Arcatao. Um, in response, the guerrillas begin rebuilding slowly both their kind of military apparatus in rural areas, but also their civilian support groups back in San Salvador and the two or three other major cities of the war. And it's that offensive, that rebuilding for that offensive, that's where Maria's story takes place. And that's what she and the people around her are all preparing for in 1987, 88, and kind of culminating in 1989. So the war goes on with a lot of US support. The war is conducted under incredibly brutal conditions, and it generates a lot of reaction in the United States itself. And Madison is one of the places it generates that reaction. Disgusting human rights abuses, concerns about unbridled US military intervention, sympathy for people like Maria and those communities all lead to a big pushback of activism and solidarity with Salvadoran refugees, with Salvadoran communities under assault, with people in civilian areas, and with elements of the FLN. And the Madison Arcatao Sister City Project emerges in that period. And there's a big push in the Congress against continuing US military aid to El Salvador, which over the course of the war is about $6 billion between military and civilian and CIA assistance, and at its height is about $1.5 million a day. So it's really substantial amounts of money. I think Madison formally, after a long process, became a sister city with Arcatao in 1986, and has provided support for a whole range of things. And Barbara will tell you a lot more about that. So, in the movie, you see Maria, you see the people she's connected to, and the guerrilla movement preparing for another big offensive against the Salvadoran government. They launched that offensive in November of 1989. And though it doesn't succeed in overthrowing the government, well, I should say, it comes close to overthrowing the government. In the end, the government is willing to bomb civilian areas in the capital city itself to stop guerrilla troops. The government launches an ugly counteroffensive, including assassinating 6 Jesuit priests and their housekeeper at the university, the Jesuit University in San Salvador. So they they stop the offensive, but they don't ultimately defeat the guerrillas. And what becomes clear is El Salvador is a stalemate. The guerrillas aren't going to win, but they're not going to lose either. And in that context, and sort of in 1989, 1990, with the end of the Cold War, um, both sides agree to negotiate. And under the auspices of the United Nations, um, over the course of about 2 years, a peace agreement gets negotiated in El Salvador that cuts the size of the Salvadoran army from about 50,000 troops to about 12,000, demobilizes the FMLN and moves them to become a political party, um, dissolves the death squads, the National Police, the Treasury Police, the National Guard, and replaces them with a new police force. Um, and start some processes of police reform, of judicial reform, and some modest land redistribution. In the end, that's a lot less than Maria and the FMLN had hoped for. It's a lot more than the Salvadoran government ever wanted to give. And I would say, in some ways, sad to say, we're in the 21st century, and this kind of ugly, brutal war succeeded in dragging El Salvador from the 19th century into the 20th. In relative terms, that's actually a big step forward. It's sad and painful one at a huge cost. The UN Truth Commission at the end of the Civil War said over 70,000 people, the vast majority of them civilian, died in this war. Um, some 90% of the human rights abuses committed during the war were committed by the government and its allies. About 20% of the country was forced abroad, fled the war either directly for political reasons or for economic uncertainty related to the war. And so you come to a peace agreement in 1992, and you have a country that's moved in some ways really forward, but it also has huge scars and and huge traumas. So I know really quickly, let me say a little bit about the post-war period. Um, for the first decade after the war is over, there's a real sense of hope, I think. The FMLN, there's a lot more freedom of speech. You can't be killed for expressing your political opinion anymore, by and large. The FMLN becomes a political party. María Serrano, in fact, gets elected as a deputy in the National Assembly. By 2009, actually, the FMLN elects the president of the country, and an FMLN president runs the country for the next 10 years. Um, for the first decade or so, the US and the UN and the European Union, Mexico, a number of other countries really want to ensure that peace remains in El Salvador, the country doesn't fall back into war. And they push hard for some reforms, for police reform, for judicial reform, for free elections. Um, but economically, while El Salvador moves away from being a mostly agro-export and agrarian economy to a more urban and a more real estate, finance, service sector kind of economy, it doesn't move toward becoming a more equitable economy, particularly. Um, and if you look, migration from El Salvador for economic reasons stays pretty steady, and migration toward the United States stays pretty steady from about 1985 through well, through 2000, and it actually accelerates starting around 2010. There were there were only a few thousand people born in El Salvador living in the United States in 1980. By 1990, there's 750,000, according to the Census Bureau, and by 2021, there are 1.3 million people who were born in El Salvador living in the US today, plus about another 1.2 million of their children. So there are 2.5 Salvadorans and Salvadoran Americans living here today where there were literally almost none in 1980. Um, those people are concentrated in LA, in the DC area, in New York, in Houston, although they have over time spread. I know there's Salvadorans in Milwaukee. I know there's Salvadorans, some in Madison, some in other places. But I think the thing that's really sort of important to point out about this is that Salvadorans who came to the United States in the 1980s, and especially those who came to LA, one of the things they encountered living in primarily Hispanic, primarily Latino, primarily Mexican and Mexican American neighborhoods, one thing they encountered was US gangs. 18th Street is the best known of these, but mostly Mexican American US gangs, partly to protect themselves. Young Salvadoran teenagers, men and boys and girls, men and women, joined the 18th Street gang in LA and formed their own gang, the Mara Salvatrucha, in response. And this is really important to emphasize. People, you read about MS-13 all the time. You hear about the 18th Street gang all the time. Both of those gangs, though they dominated El Salvador for years, were born in the United States and exported with Salvadoran young men who were deported back in the mid-90s. And local street gangs in El Salvador got transformed by this process and became the sort of US influenced, tattooed, baggy clothed gangs that we think of as MS and 13th and 18th Street today. And those gangs then in El Salvador, in response to gang violence, territorial violence, extortion, minor, though not major, drug trafficking. In response, the Salvadoran government starts sweeping people up, imprisoning them, and in that process, taking small local gangs, putting them in places where they could all meet together, and by 2003, 2004, creating national gang structures. And those gangs come to dominate significant parts of El Salvador, in large part because young men don't have, in particular, young women as well, but young men especially, don't have a lot of economic opportunity, and gangs offer something to them. in terms of opportunity, in terms of identity, in terms of community and belonging. Um, so the the Salvadoran government responds to this with first with the kinds of repression that in some ways make the problem worse, and then by secret negotiations. They first start negotiating for votes in neighborhoods that gangs control. Later on, they begin to try and negotiate truces with the gangs. None of those negotiations efforts really succeed. And so by 2015, 2016, El Salvador has the highest homicide rate, certainly in the Western world, maybe in the world as a whole. There are 100 and 2016, I think, there are 105 murders for every 100,000 people. The rate in the United States is 6. So it is whatever that is, 20 times, almost 20 times what the murder rate is in the United States. In the face of that context, in the face of uh, um, an economy that continues to stagnate and problems of corruption that really haven't been addressed, an outsider comes in, and in some ways this might sound familiar to us here, but in 2019, the mayor of San Salvador, Nayib Bukele, runs for the presidency of El Salvador as an outsider. He's not, he was in the FLN, but he's quit it. He's certainly not in the traditional right-wing party. He's a young, social media user. He's a charismatic guy, and he promises to resolve El Salvador's problems. He gets elected overwhelmingly. Um, it unsurprisingly, I'm sorry to say, turns out to be a fairly authoritarian guy. He threatens the National Assembly. He shows up there with troops when they don't agree with him on measures, on proposal he has. He uh, dominates the National Assembly and manages to fire the entire Supreme Court and the Attorney General and replace them all with his own loyalists. So he controls all three branches of government. Um, he starts his own negotiations with gangs, and when they fail, he declares all-out war. And 2 years now into the state of exception, which suspends civil liberties, 80,000 people have been summarily jailed, without trial, without access to lawyers in I think we've all seen the pictures of particularly harsh prisons, and particularly a special prison Secot that's been built to hold gang members. Um, and in some sense it's worked. El Salvador is a much safer country than it was for many years. The last time I visited last fall, people could play at night, walk through the streets in neighborhoods where 5 years before they might have had to be accompanied by police to go out in public at all. The price of that has been an enormous reduction in civil liberties, mass imprisonment, and now Bukele is in the process of muzzling the press, forcing the press, a lot of journalists into exile, restricting the freedom of non-governmental organizations, and attacking his opponents. So we have arrived today, and the Biden administration made some efforts to try and rein him in, given U.S. support and relationship with El Salvador. Most of those efforts didn't succeed, and I think the Trump administration is sympathetic to many of those efforts, wouldn't object to duplicating them here, replicating them here. So in some ways, we've seen El Salvador go from a period of ugly civil war, an opening toward democracy, and now in the face of the failures of economic reform in a lot of ways, return to a more modern but still real form of authoritarianism and repression. So I wish I could end with a sort of happier account of where we stand today, but I guess I'll stop there. I will turn this over to Barbara, and then we can go from there.
Thank you so much, Geoff, and Barbara will let you take it away.
Okay. Thank you so much, Geoff. That was incredible history, heartfelt history also of El Salvador. I learned many new things with you talking about it. Um, I've been a part of the U.S. El Salvador Sister Cities, Madison, who is our parent organization of the Madison Arcatau Sister City Project. As Geoff mentioned, it began in 1986 when the first people went down from the U.S. People up here, people in Madison knew about the war going on in Salvador, in El Salvador. There were sanctuary cities in the U.S., and so Madison became a sister city of Arcatau and El Salvador. Arcatau is a beautiful little community in the outskirts of El Salvador, of San Salvador. It's about 3 hours from San Salvador City, and it's actually on the border with Honduras. So you can walk up La Cañada and you can be in Honduras in about 3 hours time. But to say just a little bit about our project, it began in 1986, and people went down and were actually human witnesses to try and stop the repression of that whole area where Arcatau is in the department, what used to be the Department of Chalatenango. And what people wanted the most at that point, these are basically civilians, was to get the word out as what was happening. People, as Geoff mentioned, it was the scorched earth policy, and so get the people out of there, or indiscriminately just kill them. And so that's when many people from Arcatau actually fled into Honduras, went to encampments there, lived there for years. Some people did stay in Arcatau during the whole war period. And so it was a very difficult couple of years up until the peace accords. The peace accords were signed actually in Mexico in Chapultepec Park. And as Geoff said, again, relative peace began. So the Sister City Project started kind of relating to the people, not in a wartime mode, but actually trying to relate with each other, rebuild their community. And so Madison had the relationship, continued the relationship, and for years looked at each other and said, how do we support each other? I think one of the beautiful things that the Sister City Project, the Madison Sister City Project, has given all of us, both the Salvadorans and those of us who have had the privilege of going and being in Arcatau, is the whole idea of what you do, what you can do together. And I think Maria very beautifully brings that out in the film. She says near the end, we have to spread the word of the need to organize and how together you are capable of achieving things that you can't do alone. And people who aren't organized run scared in all directions. And so I like to think that the Sister City Project is really about cross-border solidarity and cross-border organizing. We, of course, as privileged people from the US, are able to give money to support physical projects in El Salvador, and particularly in Arcatau. But I think the major realization on both sides is that we need to keep supporting each other's organizing. And I think that rings true right now, even more so here in the US, that we can learn so much from our compañeros in El Salvador as far as organizing, even though the project began almost 40 years ago. So there was a time in the 1990s, early 2000s, where we were very much in contact. You may remember, some of you, that El Salvador was very much on the map of everyone because people were supporting and people were looking to take the refugees in, looking to help kind of continue this cross-border organizing and solidarity. And then, as many of us know, El Salvador kind of fell off the map. And so this solidarity that happened way before was kind of like, well, now what do we do? I mean, we still support the people in Arcatao and the people, the grassroots movement in El Salvador. But now we're really looking, again, as Geoff mentioned, the terrible immigration to the US, and the terrible deportation of so many people right now. It's really, I think, really scary what we're seeing here under our administration in the US, and to see what's taking place, not only with people who are bona fide US citizens, but also with children, with very vulnerable people. We have heard from our sisters and brothers in Arcatao that one of their major concerns is the state of exception. And many young men have been taken off the streets of Arcatao, have been disappeared, and their families have no idea where they are. So we continue to work with the people of El Salvador, with the grassroots movement in El Salvador, and it's not an easy thing to end on, as Geoff said, on a positive tone, because we're coming up, next year will be the 40th year of Madison Arcatao Sister City Project, and yet we want to celebrate, but I think we want to more commemorate and figure what a meaningful celebration of these 40 years would be, because there's certainly not a lot to celebrate either there or here, except to say that we're celebrating international solidarity and friendships across borders and the organizing that goes along with that. So I will leave it off there.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for adding the your own ongoing experience with the Sister City Project. I would like to invite anyone that is here in the meeting to add questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself. I'll give folks a minute or two here to submit any questions, and if no questions are forthcoming, I know Essie and I have questions. Oh, it looks like there might already be a question, or a comment. Oh, that was a comment from Essie. Okay, I jumped the gun there, but do we have any questions from participants right off the bat? Well, how about I start with a question, and I think maybe from there that I'm sure we'll get some folks feeling more comfortable to ask their questions. Before we started the meeting today, both of the speakers and myself and Essie were chatting for a couple of minutes, and there's kind of the topic of where is Maria at now came up, and I think that might be something that the folks who had an opportunity to watch the film would be interested in hearing. So I don't know if either of you could give a little update there. That would be really helpful, please.
Go ahead.
I can start, and maybe you can add on, Geoff, please. I originally met Maria actually in Arcatao in 1998 when I went on my first delegation to Arcatao, and kind of followed her, have been with her several times. My husband and I stayed in her home. She is an incredibly dynamic woman, as you can see from the movie. The movie ends actually before the war ends, so you can see her hopes and everything. Just to tell you a little bit more about her, she in the movie is kind of educating people. They're sitting down with little notebooks, and she's really saying to people, you're gonna go to school after the war, right? You're really gonna go to school, because we all need to study, and we continue. So Maria did continue studying. She became a professor of social sciences and mathematics. She taught in Arcatao. She went on to become a representative of the National Assembly for the FMLN. She was then in the party. She became the congressperson. She's held various positions in various different governments. And then she became in 2019, under the Bukele regime, she was asked to be the Minister of Local Development. And from there, we've kind of lost contact with each other. I don't know if Geoff would like to say anything more.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, I've met Maria several times to say she's a really dynamic figure. I mean, she's pretty amazing. And particularly for somebody who, started off as an honest to God campesina who married, she married at age 16, 15. Did not have more than a sixth grade education, was one of 10 children. She was not a, college radical. She was a poor rural woman who went on. So her story is really very impressive. And actually, I think I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that's really striking to the movie that you see in the movie is the way in which not just Maria and not just her own daughters, but you see young women interspersed throughout the ranks of the guerrilla movement, and in a country that, as I said, is heavily, pretty conservative culturally, where there's a lot of traditional machismo. In a lot of ways, the war transformed the roles, at least of certain sectors of women in society, and that's a really interesting thing. And Maria is kind of one of the symbols of that. Um, I guess the other thing I'd say is on the other end of her career, so El Salvador's had a years-long battle led by campesino groups, mostly in the northern region in Chalatenango and the next province over to oppose gold mining, because gold mining done by big foreign corporations dumps poisonous waste and ruins rivers, basically. And they scored this big victory, and El Salvador became the first country in the world, after years of struggle, to ban metallic mining. The National Assembly voted for it, the president signed the bill, and it banned metallic mining for environmental reasons and for the protection of peasant communities. Maria had joined the Bukele government. She worked on local development issues, which within the context of the Bukele government is probably a better piece of what they did. Um, Bukele overturned the metallic mining law and permitted foreign investors to come in and invest in gold mining once again. And what I understand is that Maria resigned from the government in opposition to that. And that would make sense given that it's where she comes from in El Salvador and her own communities, right? And her social strata, that's the word, that were most affected by this and that most led the fight against it. So what I understand is that she resigned from her position with the Bukele government late last year, I believe, but I don't know where she is, what she's doing now.
Thank you very much to both of you. Um, I have another question, which is actually this is an essay question. I don't want to take credit for it, but how was the film received in the U.S. and in El Salvador?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Hmm.
Uh, I mean, when it was made, it was shown pretty widely. You can see
Mhm.
it's there's a lot of handheld camera. Um, the filmmakers, the two women who are the filmmakers, put themselves a lot of personal risk, right? I mean, you can see they're hiding out from mortar shells landing nearby.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's an art house is the wrong term because it's not like arty cultural entertainment, but it's not like it was a Hollywood blockbuster film.
Mhm.
But I think it had a real impact in the places and ways it was shown, because I think it does what it intended, which is to humanize the story of El Salvador and not make it some abstract thing about a US supported government against allegedly communist guerrillas. It helped make it a real story about real people, and you understood who they were and what they're fighting for.
And I would say too, I think if someone would like to go to Arcatau, we have yearly delegations. So just go to our website, mascp.org, and you can say you're interested in the next coming delegation, which will be, I believe, next April. But one of the things I wanted to say in relation to what Geoff was saying is that people, if you do go to our sister city of Arcatau, um, you will meet people just like Maria who went through the war, who will tell you their stories, and also many women who are particularly upset, as I said before, nowadays, because their sons have literally been disappeared from the streets in Arcatau. Before the gangs had not, up to a couple years ago, the gangs had kind of left Arcatau alone, but now a large part of the country is under militarization. So there are troops back in Arcatau. There are stationed people that are kind of visualizing what's going on. And I have to say, there's also great the political situation is being played out in Arcatau as much as it is in the whole country, as far as some of the people do support the Bukele government because Bukele was able to bring down the crime rate that was there. But then people ask, at what expense? If you know your son is not safe walking down the street in a community way outside of San Salvador, then what is this state of exception? Is it worth it getting rid of the gangs in that way, supposedly getting rid of the gangs that way? So it's a very difficult situation.
We
Can I
do.
make a
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Geoff. Go
just
ahead.
a sort of related point, a little bit of an advertisement, but so I spent a lot of time looking at the question of gang violence in El Salvador and the government's response to gang violence, which all along has been pretty harsh. And not, I don't say that to justify gang violence or criminality in any way. I think you need to respond to it. But, we really began to look at are there more prevention-oriented approaches you could take? And I say I'm interested in this in part because I worked, before I worked on foreign policy issues, I was a high school teacher and I worked mostly with groups of at-risk kids. And so it's sort of, that's who's vulnerable to gang recruitment, right? And I think it's pretty clear that violence prevention programs are worth investing in, and they're worth investing in because what they help do, and there are a range of them, and some are better than others and whatever, but what they help do is move kids from isolation, where they're easily recruited, where they're looking for community and the gang offers it, to a network of friendships and relationships with peers and adults that provide some level of protection, and alternative ways of thinking about yourself in the world, apart from the universe of gangs. And one of the interesting reasons why Chalatenango, where Maria was, and that's the focus of the film, was less penetrated by gangs, is because in many ways it was a lot more politically organized, and it had youth groups and teenage, bands, and it had things connected to political activism. And if you look at El Salvador as a whole, in fact, areas where there was more community organization and community networks, and where people were less isolated and disconnected, had far less gang presence than places that were more marginal and less socially organized. And I actually think there's a parallel to that in the United States. And if you look at more and less safe communities and effective ways to engage in violence prevention. Just an advertisement.
No, that's
Yeah, and
yeah.
oh,
No, you go ahead, Barbara. I'm
I
sorry.
was going to do another advertisement there.
Go for it.
I think one of the projects, and it extends well beyond Arcatau, is that Our project, together with other groups, two different, what they call parishes, parroquias, Arcatao, the whole municipality, and Nueva Trinidad, have what they call human development scholarships. And we support, and many different groups support these scholarships. But one person in our group asked, I think a year ago on a delegation, and said, so have these scholarships made a difference? Are young people staying in the country? And they said the persons that were involved in the scholarship program kind of sat around and thought, and they said, actually, we don't think any of those people that we know of have left to go to the States. Some of the people have gone back to Arcatao to teach. Some of the people, or many of the people, have stayed in San Salvador. It's very difficult to get a job in El Salvador these days. But I think talking about prevention, Geoff, that's a really good point, that if we can get, and maybe it's not more scholarships, but more ideas of prevention programs. And also one other thing, I know people in Arcatao and people in El Salvador in general are very intent on historic memory. And so they want everyone to recall what happened so that it will never happen again. And people in Arcatao have told us, that's very difficult to get our children to understand that, because they didn't live through the war. They didn't live through bullets going over their heads. And so they don't know. And so there's a big, big push, which I think any country needs to do, is really look back at your historic memory and tell the truth, and then try and figure out with this truth where we go from there to prevent it from happening, to prevent people from joining gangs, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd say that goes for as well here in the US and in El Salvador.
Absolutely. Actually, one of the questions that we have in the chat, you just touched on this a little bit, Barbara, about the scholarships. Anna asks, what are some of the most significant achievements or projects that have come from this partnership, the Madison Arcatao partnership? And how do people in Arcatao today view this relationship?
Well, that's kind of difficult. I think the scholarships is one thing. If you'd like to think of something even more literally down to earth and having to do with living, the Directiva in Arcatao said that one of their big projects, and this is a bricks and mortar project, even though we're about organizing, but it's organizing in a way, was to fix two wells which provide 512 families in Arcatao with clean water. They were breaking up. So last year we helped raise money for a lot of that. It was a beautiful partnership because the people in Arcatao said, look, we'll put in all the labor, we'll do this and that. We actually need money for the actual things to put up to fix the wells so that they will not be contaminated. So that's one of the projects. We were I believe it was the metallic mining law was 2016, I think.
That's right, yeah.
We were part of a whole network, of course, of many groups, both here in the US and in El Salvador, and in different parts of the world, really working on that, writing letters. People became very creative. We actually, in one moment, our project collected any used gold to really talk about it should not be mined. Let's reuse all the gold that anyone has. And so for a year or two, we had a campaign of collecting even from your teeth, if you had gold in your teeth, to collect the gold and then make the point, don't produce more gold. Do not do this metallic mining because it has dire effects on the water in so many places. So, and now we see that part of our struggle is going to be again to really go against the mining law, which was overturned. It was such a beautiful victory.
Yeah.
And so important.
I would say we have one additional question here in the chat, which depending on how long the follow-up takes for that might be our final question for today. Dan asks, what is the relationship like today between the Bukele government and the modern Salvadoran church?
So there is still, so the Salvadoran church, there was a moment in the Christian-based communities, which are kind of activist grassroots community groups, usually led by lay delegates studying the Bible and inspired by liberation theology, was separated from and sometimes at odds with the hierarchy of the church until really Monsignor Romero kind of brings them together, which in part is why he's assassinated. And since then, the relationship between the church hierarchy and the grassroots base, the Christian-based communities are smaller than they were in the 1980s and 1990s probably, but still existent in El Salvador. The official, if that's the word, church, the church hierarchy has gone back and forth in its political attitudes. I mean, it continues to be an important force in the country. El Salvador is though it's got a big evangelical Protestant community, still a very Catholic country, and the church is still a big force. The current archbishop has been considered a conservative, relatively speaking, but he and the Council of Bishops have begun speaking out. They condemned the state of exception recently, and they've been somewhat more outspoken than in the past about some of these issues in the last couple of years.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, we're almost at time. Does anyone have any final burning question for Barbara or Geoff? Or any final thoughts, actually, Barbara or Geoff, that either of you would like to share?
Okay, just one really quick remark. I mean, I mentioned in the course of this the activist U.S. movement, of which the Madison Arcatao Sister City Project is one huge example, but the U.S. activist movement that helped oppose human rights abuses and U.S. support for the extreme right in El Salvador. And I think that helped contribute to the end of the war. I think U.S. citizens made a big difference there. I'm glad of that because I also think the U.S. had a big responsibility for supporting the Salvadoran government, and I personally think that's a moral stain, frankly. So I'm really happy to do this talk. I'm really glad there's this kind of interest, and just to say, I'm really glad that projects like the Madison Arcatao Sister City Project continue.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, I think the final thought is, and Maria talked about it, is organizing. That without organizing, it's really impossible to change the world. And I learned that from the Salvadoran people, from the Mexican people where I live, that if you do join together, you can change. And maybe it sounds very idealistic, but I have to believe that it's true. I've heard so many people that have joined a group, as you say, Geoff, in community, not the gangs, but find a community and an activist community that is our only hope for really changing the world. So I think we all need to organize.
Yeah, I'm also giving a silent clap for that from my office because they always say that there's strength in numbers, and obviously that can go in both ways, negatively or positively. But I think finding out that we have things in common and ethics and morals and beliefs with other people, not only do you create friendships, but you also it can help sort of bolster your own ability to stay strong and hopeful and have the energy to keep fighting for things that we care about. So thank you again, Geoff and Barbara, for participating in this event today. Thank you to all of the participants that stuck around for the Q&A and for today's presentation. Finally, I also want to thank the IRIS NRC and my program, Latin American Studies, for co-sponsoring today's event. You will be receiving a post-event email that will provide a link and digital resources and the recording for today. So thank you again. And Essie, I don't know if you have anything that you need to share before we finish up here today.
You got it. Thank you for moderating, and thank you all for being here today. I learned so much.
Yeah.
And I'll have to email my burning questions another time to Barbara.